purpose of this video is to give you a brief history on relief printing and block printing, and to offer a tutorial and demonstrations at the end of the video, so you'll be able to do a version of your own blocks yourself. The idea is you're not expected to create blocks or prints using the same tools or the same materials that were historically used. The idea is to get the experience of what it's like to create block prints. We don't normally associate printing with the ancient world, but in fact, it's prehistoric. Cave paintings were the first place we saw prints being used, on cave walls where our ancestors would replicate their own hands in a pattern that was pleasing to them for religious purposes probably, but it was the very first type of printing that ever was done. The Chinese invented printing in relief. They carved their blocks from one piece of wood in reverse and printed them with ink. Over the centuries, printing in the Orient became highly sophisticated. The Japanese developed refined methods of printing that emulated continuous tone printing that we're familiar with today. Woodcuts came to the West via the Silk Road in the early Middle Ages. These early European woodcuts had a certain naivete to them, and yet you can see in them the refinements that would later lead to more detailed printmaking techniques. Here you can see a woodcut artist working. It's from the Tudor period by his dress, and also note that he's working with knives on his table. That was primarily the tool that the medieval cutters used for making their cuts. The principle of relief printing works in that the ink is placed on the raised surface of the wood. So anything you don't want to print, you cut away, and what's left behind takes the ink and can be printed onto the paper. The thing to remember, of course, is that anything you cut on the wood will be printed in reverse, which is particularly important when you're doing letters, characters, or anything that would look strange if printed backwards. With the dawn of the Renaissance, master woodcut artists like Albrecht Dürer were able to create masterpieces in print just using a knife, cutting on a plank of wood. Wood cutting is still used in the graphic arts and is a major component of most art school programs. Here you can see a student cutting on a very, very large woodcut, basically a 4x8 sheet of plywood. Proving the adage that art students get to use all the fun tools, here is one using a pavement roller to take the print with what must have been rather satisfying results. Any tools that cut wood are suitable to work with on the wood plank. These are chisels and gouges that many artists use to create their woodcuts. Etching as a form of printing emerged around 1500 in Europe. Even ancient times, armor was commonly etched on as a decorative process. Etching on metal offered the opportunity to print highly detailed lines and marks. These are also referred to as intaglio prints. Etching works on the reverse principle of relief printing. There is a relief, but the relief isn't inked. The ink is spread over the entire plate after the marks are made on it. Then the ink is wiped from the surface of the plate, leaving the ink residue in scratches and grooves that are left behind. It takes a great deal of pressure to get a print from an intaglio plate. So dampened paper is used, laid down on the plate, then run through an etching press, and when it's pulled off, the paper is pressed into the ink on the plate, and then the paper is pulled off and you can see the printed result. This is an etching press. You can tell that because of the long arms, it requires a great deal of leverage because it is placing tremendous pressure on the plate that's going through the cylinders. Etching in this way added a certain artistry to printing because the artist was able to sometimes leave residues of ink on the surface of the plate in areas that weren't cut, giving it a kind of a mood that you could not create in other forms of printmaking. This is an intaglio print by the Dutch old master Rembrandt. William Blake was arguably the very first private press printer. He created his own intaglio plates and either hand-colored them or colored the plates themselves prior to printing. There's a lot that's not known about exactly how he created some of his prints. He often engraved the text along with the illustration on the same plate. This is an etching of Samuel Taylor Coleridge, which shows a great deal of nuance and tonal range. And this is an etching of his daughter Sarah Coleridge, and finally an etching of her daughter Edith Coleridge. You can see how the nuances and detail of the prints strives to recreate the continuous tone of a pencil sketch, with great success. The etchings by Gustave Doré in Coleridge's Rime of the Ancient Mariner, the edition of 1875, have become iconic. The problem with plates engraved on steel or copper was that you couldn't get very many impressions from them. Passing them through a press under intense pressure caused them to wear out rather quickly. This meant edition runs were quite small and required the plate to be remade or recast if it was a long run. Fortunately, in the late 18th century, an engraver named Thomas Bewick decided to try out his metal engraving tools on the end grain of English boxwood. Using the more traditional relief print that we're familiar with from woodcuts, he was able to recreate and recapture the detail of etching in a much faster, much cheaper method. As well, the blocks of wood proved to last for thousands of prints, unlike the metal ones, which wore out after several hundred impressions. This revolutionized illustration in magazines and books. From the 18th century, where there were hardly any illustrations in newspapers and magazines, to the 19th century, where entire covers could be created to illustrate a magazine. This made illustrated news magazines very popular in the 19th century. In this scenario, an artist would do a drawing, which the newspaper would cut up into sections and hand out to several different engravers who work in tandem to create the entire page. They just leave a tiny edge of the block uncut. When all the blocks come together at the newspaper again, the master engraver would finish the edges of the engravings and join everything up. Commercial wood engraving faded in the late 19th century, but it continued to be used as a way for artists to express themselves and illustrate books well into the 20th century. Here we have a spread from the Kelmscott Chaucer, produced by William Morris. Everything except the type is wood engraved. The illustrations based on designs by Edward Burne-Jones, and the border and drop caps designed by William Morris. Here is a composite of photos showing the progression of a wood engraving. This is a drop cap O from a fairy tale. You can see how the darkened block is being carved away, revealing the light wood, leaving just what is left to print. In the early 20th century, artists discovered that linoleum, the flooring material, was ideal for making block cuts that emulated woodcuts. Made from a mixture of ground cork, resin, and linseed oil, linoleum was plentiful and cheap, and could be mounted up on a board to bring it to type high to be used on any kind of letterpress. You could cut lino with pretty much anything sharp, particularly a knife, but gouges work beautifully. Being softer than wood, it is easier to cut lino, and there is no grain to fight against. Here is a side-by-side representation of a lino cut. On the left, we have the cut lino that's been on the press and already printed, and on the right we have the resulting print. It should become apparent that anything you can cut into that's flat could make a good print. Rubber stamps make use of soft rubber to produce a print, and the same can be done with an eraser, for example, or even a potato, which has the consistency and firmness to be able to produce a rudimentary print. Which brings us back to the beginning, where the only form we had was what our body could provide us. Okay. Hi there. So we're going to do a demo right now of wood engraving. We're going to work towards the
I would say, the more complex uh, engraving and block cutting styles to the simplest that we're going to be demonstrating here. And um, in that respect, let me start showing you the tools, some of the tools that we use in wood engraving. They're like jeweler's tools, really. It's a good way to describe them. But they've been refined over the years. So traditionally, wood engravers worked on boxwood, English boxwood. But now boxwood in England is a protected species. So it's but the good news is that you can do um, you can engrave on the end grain, which is the tree ring side of this, if you can see that. On the side that has the grain, it creates a very smooth, smooth contoured cut, like this. Turn the block, not your hand. Create an engraved groove. It can be more easily demonstrated on this, which is it's a resin grave block. This is a polymer that they've been working on for decades to emulate English boxwood. I've put a layer of ink on it, India ink, as to provide a satisfying contrast, so that I can demonstrate how this works. This is how a resin grave comes to you. You can, I think, Above Ground Art Supply, risking an endorsement, in Toronto has keeps this in supply so that you can order it from them. And they also have standard graving tools, so just the square gravers, and fairly narrow ones too, that can be acquired there if you feel so compelled. The power of wood engraving is the detail you can achieve at a very tiny level. I should you might remember from the video when you saw the picture of the young boys working on the wood engraving in that old wood engraving, how they were working on these pads. And this is what's called an engraver's pad. It's a sand filled with sand, leather filled with sand sewn around the edge. It makes it really easy to spin the block. And it also keeps the block somewhat elevated. So it keeps the blade away from your hands in case it skates, although if you're adept at it, you shouldn't have to worry about that too much. So you can tend to make short, curving cuts. The idea is not to do really long cuts. It's a very meticulous and very, I don't know, attention to detail type of thing. It's also very Zen-like when you get into it. So I've made one white line, and it literally that's going to turn up as a white line on the printed version. So this is still a very black block. It hasn't been engraved very much. And I can go and emulate what I've done by putting a second line in. Taking a chance by doing a long continuous one, but that's, I have some experience of this. So what I've done here is I've created these two white lines. The line in between is the black line. Everything is reverse, so. we go. Now I'm going to go and widen that white line using a different type of tool. There are many different types of tools. I won't get into all of the different variants right now, but there's spit stickers and scorpers and gravers and all sorts of arcane types of names for them. I'm not going to get into too much detail here because it's something you can fall into very easily when you're doing it, but to watch it might be a little tedious. So here's a small square tool that creates a wider cut, and it illuminates more of my line. I'm going to clear out a large white area around it. Does a somewhat cleaner job of it too. You can see how it's fraying around the edge here. So this is good for clearing out wider areas of white. And you can go in. I'm not going to compose now, so there's looks like a beginning of a black line of some sort in there. So that's resin grave. And this one I was showing you before, this has an engraving on one side. Some kind of acrobat. And on this side you can see the maple. This is maple. Maple is a good wood for using for wood engraving. So are any of the fruit woods. One thing you really have to keep in mind is that when you do get a block of it, it has to be polished almost to a glass surface. This feels like glass that I'm rubbing right now. And that requires several grades of sandpaper, right from one that seems fairly fine, like a 600 or something like that, down to whatever the finest sandpaper you can get before it gets wet. The blocks can't get wet because that will sink into the fibers of the wood and cause them to expand when it dries. So it has to stay perfectly dry. So that's wood engraving. It's linoleum, and I already spoke to you about the background and the history of linoleum and its uses. These are cuts here. They've already been done. You can see sort of the working of them. People do very fine work. This is an incredibly fine lino cut done by a friend of mine. So the original lino was called Battleship because it was gray and it came off of battleships. I think the story I've heard, and I have no idea whether this is apocryphal or not, is that the artists would go down to the docks in San Francisco when they'd bring the fleet in, have it retrofitted. This is probably in the 1920s, and they would roll up all the aisleways inside the battleships with this linoleum and dump it on the docks, and it was garbage. So the artists would go down and cut off as much as they wanted and use it. Pretty much an infinite supply for them for their needs. Later, the linoleum, of course, even in that time was popular as a flooring, and it could come in many colors and many different patterns. You would probably normally see this color, this brown color, in art stores today. These are speedball cutting tools. Again, art stores tend to carry these, and they're relatively inexpensive. Take the tool in your hand securely. Always cut away from yourself, I guess is the best thing to say. This lino is old, it's very hard. That's good. That means you can go very detailed. Almost like, yeah. The thing I like about lino is you can really make expressive moves with the cutter. Sometimes it's good to get a couple of different nibs. They often come with some with them already, in different sizes and shapes. V-gouges, small V-gouges, U-gouges. This is a U-gouge right here, for making large cuts. And the other nice thing about lino is that you tend, I mean, this one is better. The brown stuff is, you can actually see pencil marks on it for doing your drawing. You can see that's a heron, I think. And but the gray works as well for that as so the last one I'm going to demo for you is the easiest. And I should note that you can also get something called soft oleum at art stores, which would be a substitute for this. Or you can just get yourself a nice big eraser. This is just a white Staedtler eraser. It's fairly old now. You can use lino tools or you can use a knife, which I have to get. So with eraser cuts, we can work fairly easily. You can draw your, whatever, I'm going to do my initials. Something like that. So I've got knives here. This is a Olfa knife you can get at art stores. These are like more or less like box cutters. This is also Olfa, but you can get them at hardware stores or whatever. The nice thing about all these knives is that you can control the depth at which the knife point sticks out, which is a great safety feature. So I'm going to use one that, these are fairly common to find. So you cut an angle away from what it is you're going against, so that anything you're cutting out is like a little wedge shape. There we go. And the opposite over here. Just going to cut in a little ways and tail it out like that. And do the same thing, the opposite direction over here. And this is the way Dürer and all the masters of the Northern Renaissance and the great woodcutters of Europe, this is how the German, especially particularly the German cutters and East European cutters, did their engravings and woodcuts just with a knife, and just pop it out like that. I hope you can see what I'm doing there. So that's how to work with a knife. You can also use lino tools on these things, which are even easier. Don't want to do anything too complex in the demo, otherwise you'll be drifting off. That's good enough for now. Just going to carve that out. Great. So there, I've done my initials. Has anyone spotted the problem I've got yet? There's an issue with this particular block. That means it's not going to work out very well. Well, we'll find out in a minute. So that's the other thing you can get is stamp pad. Stamp pads are fairly easy to find, I think, still. Maybe these brown ones might be a little better. Yeah, there we go. You can see it quite clearly. So I can show you some interesting eraser cuts that have been done some time ago. These are done on, I believe it's it's a soft oleum, or that sort of, you can buy this stuff at art stores. It's quite similar to eraser material. It may even be eraser material, but it's in large flat sheets so that you can create stamps. And show that you can do some rather nice work, unlike my LT in reverse. So, good stamp, and here's another one. There we go. So you can get quite a lot of detail in the cuts if you're using a fine gouge tool for a lino tool or something like that. So that's block printing. I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you for watching.